Thank you very much. Is that audible to everybody? Wonderful, thank you. Andrew, it's a pleasure to see you after a couple of years. I think last I saw you, both of us were in Kabul, and Kabul was a different place than it is now. And I'm glad that we are able to meet again, obviously under drastically different circumstances. But I have been reading your book with great interest. It is heavily annotated, as you can see. And I hope that I can take it back with me with a signature from you, obviously.
I just hope those aren't mistakes.
But no, I think that the observation I wanted to make about the book is that it's a very well-written book, very thoroughly researched. And those are not the only virtues of the book. I lived through some of those moments, as you did as well, in those final days in Kabul. And it was very difficult reading for me because you go through the entire process once again in great detail. You live through the failures that you see happening around you in that on those last few days in Kabul. I was, as a civil servant in the Security Council, I was part of some of the meetings that you described, part of some of the phone calls that you described, but also not part of some of the pivotal moments that you described, which I think speaks to the secretive, but also highly tightly held nature of the activities that happened in the last few days of the country, where even high-level generals, for example, as you notice note in the book, were not involved in some of the key decision-making events. Now, I've got some questions here that I might go by, but I think it's going to be conversational. I hope that we can have a fruitful conversation for everybody's benefit. I think the book starts with, which I thought was an act of courage, and it starts with you expressing that you were wrong in your initial skepticism when Afghans told you that they feared retribution by the Taliban, and you were skeptical. But later events proved that your skepticism was perhaps unwarranted. And I thought that was an act of courage that you started the book with that, and you've followed that up with a number of other observations. Key among them is that in that chapter about when Kabul is falling and the president is leaving in his helicopter, it seems to me that the U.S. Embassy is busy destroying their documents. They're busy ferrying their staff to the airport. The Afghan president is busy getting on his own helicopter. Some of the soldiers are busy doing their things in these isolated checkpoints with no direction. You get a sense that in the final days in Kabul in August of 2021, nobody was in charge. Was that your experience? Can you reflect on that a little bit?
This is probably going to be one of many questions where the best answer is going to come from you, because you had a front row seat to it, whereas I was relying in most cases, or in many cases, on the perspectives of the characters in the book. And I should also note that Shuja and I spoke on several occasions. His accounts were not ultimately included in the book, but did help to inform it in a way nonetheless. But first of all, I had been outside Afghanistan for probably 3 or 4 weeks before the final days of the Republic, and so my experience of those last few weeks was from afar and through my friends via WhatsApp and the news, and I'd often found that my experience of Afghanistan, witnessed from afar through the media, surprise, surprise, was a lot more. It was exaggerated in comparison to the experience that I would have once I returned. And I would go home at Christmas time most years for a month or two, and I'd always feel very nervous about going back because of what I would read in the news in that time. And sure enough, when I would return to Kabul, I would always, within a matter of hours, I would feel as though I was home, and that the news reports that I'd been reading, although I'm certainly not saying that they were inaccurate or false, but they depicted a certain a picture of Afghanistan that was, you know, the worst side of Afghanistan, the most violent side, and rarely the day-to-day life that typified my experience, and I'm sure your experience for the entire time that I was there and over the course of your life. So that said, I mean, it was pretty alarming watching first of all the collapse of the very rural districts of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is split into 34 provinces and about 400 districts, and after Joe Biden announced he confirmed that the US would be withdrawing in April 2021 over the course of the next several months, that triggered this military offensive countrywide by the Taliban, who first of all concentrated on the very rural areas, the ones that they knew the government weren't necessarily going to put up a huge fight for. And that continued for several months up until the beginning of August, when the provincial capitals, the 34 provincial capitals, started to come under threat. And at this point I was at a wedding in France, and it was literally on the day of the wedding that the first of these 34 provincial capitals fell, and then the next day another 2 fell, and that was pretty alarming. And within a couple of days of that, it had gotten to the point where I thought, if I don't get back now, I'm going to either I'm going to get trapped outside, as you know, it looked as though the Taliban was going to get close enough to Kabul that the airport would probably close down, and at which point it would be impossible for me to return. So it was certainly very alarming. When I travelled to France for this wedding, I never in a million years thought that I would have to consider cutting my trip short in order to get back to Kabul before the Taliban came to town.
To speak to that, Andrew, you arrived from France to Kabul on the 14th of August, approximately 24 hours before the collapse of the country. And you tell the story of the following day, the 15th of August, where this person in the presidential palace, Hamid Safi, follows his boss, Wahid Omar, who was the president's media chief. And Wahid Omar tells them that, look, I have no plan. Don't look at me for direction, because everything is unraveling so fast. And that, I think, is a very telling part of the story, because when you came to Afghanistan on the 14th of August, I'm pretty certain that you were not expecting collapse to happen within 24 hours of your arrival. And to the extent that I know, even the American embassy was not expecting it to be that fast in those final days. And so when I read that line, when the president's chief media officer said, "I don't have a plan," that was exactly the situation I found myself on that day, because I didn't have a plan either. I left home that morning, put on my suit, took my briefcase the way yuppie professionals do in these places, went to work, trying to get some work done that morning in the presidential palace, and by 11 o'clock it was very obvious that this is unlike any other day. And by midnight that night on the 15th and the 16th of August, I found myself on a plane parked on the tarmac of Kabul airport in the middle of the night, with no crew, no fuel, and no pilot. But I knew that a few rows ahead of me was sitting the Vice President of Afghanistan, Vice President Danish. And we'd been waiting for 4 or 5 hours on this plane, waiting for who knows what, for a pilot to show up, the crew to show up, somehow the plane to fill up with fuel so we could leave. But at one point I noticed that the Vice President was leaving the plane, and I thought maybe the Vice President knows something that I don't know. And it was very much like this Hamid Safi actually following his boss, Wahid Omar, thinking maybe he knows something that he does not know. But Wahid Omar had no plan. The vice president had no plan either. But luckily for the vice president, his armored vehicles were actually just underneath the airplane. And out of sheer luck for us, the airplanes actually had Samsung chargers, which I plugged into my phone, this phone actually, to charge it back up and start calling the Americans, start calling NATO officials, start calling others to rescue the vice president and maybe hopefully along with him rescue some of the other people that were in his entourage. So that anecdote, I think the point I'm trying to make is that when the final days and the final hours of Kabul came through, nobody had a plan. The president apparently was also paralyzed, and everybody was taken aback because, like you were not expecting that the Kabul, the entire country to fall within 24 hours of your arrival. Can you reflect about on the events as to how fast they moved, and how the people you interacted with, how unawares they were caught, and whether you expected this thing to unravel as fast as it really did? Maybe you have also spoken to some Taliban on the other side who might have told you about how unexpected it was for them actually to enter Kabul that day as well. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, as you said, even the Taliban were shocked at the speed with which they got to the edge of Kabul. And I think it was just in the end, it was the morale within the Afghan security forces was such that once the dominoes started falling in these pivotal cities, these provincial capitals that had always, apart from a couple of cases, had always maintained their security against the Taliban, despite years of borderline siege situations. Once they started collapsing, I think it just triggered this collapse of morale, and one city folded after another, and the deals that had started to be struck in order for the senior members of the security forces to survive this transition gathered speed, and army units started retreating towards the capital en masse, and it got to the point where on August 15, which I think the day before, we probably still thought there was at least a few days before the Taliban got within range of Kabul. And I mean, for me, that morning, I had booked a couple of tickets with Emirates for that week, just as backups in case just to have. I didn't know whether I would use them or why I would use them, but I booked them nonetheless. And so that morning, I spent it from about 10 to 11 a.m. going to a health clinic to get a PCR test so I could board an Emirates flight with a negative PCR test, hopefully. And it was coming out of that health clinic that the final collapse was triggered, and you might have experienced this as well. I know some of the people in the palace that I spoke to did. As I walked out of this health clinic, which is probably a couple of kilometres from the palace, I heard some distant gunfire. And
was this Westex clinic?
It wasn't, but it was. It wasn't, but it was the German clinic. But
German clinic.
Yeah, but and along following this distant gunfire, people were just streaming down the streets. Cars that were driving towards the centre of the city were turning around in the middle of the road and heading back from where they'd come. And I stopped and asked someone what was happening, and they said, "The Taliban's in Kabul. The Taliban's in Kabul." And I didn't have any reason to disbelieve them at this point. It turned out that this gunfire was just security guards outside various bank branches trying to control the crowds of account holders trying to get in to withdraw their savings. And it seemed to be this moment, and this was something that I found was a consistent sequence of events as described by anyone else who was in Kabul that day, that it seemed to trigger the final collapse. And the idea that the Taliban were in Kabul, and that after all this momentum that they'd gathered over the previous months, security forces just started shedding their uniforms. A lot of them had come to work that day with civilian clothes under their uniforms in preparation. Some of them had anyway. And they started stripping down in the street and abandoning their vehicles, leaving the keys in the ignition and melting back into the crowds. And within a couple of hours, as I saw it, the streets were abandoned of all the previous, the government's security infrastructure. And Kabul is, by this stage, was a very militarised city. It was military checkpoints at every major intersection. And so at this point, when I was driving through the city on my motorbike, and it got to the point where there were no soldiers, no policemen where there should have been, and that was the point where, and it happened quickly within a couple of hours, that it was all gone, and according to those I spoke to in the palace for the book, when they started to reach out to their, the Minister of the Interior, the head of the police force, and the head of the intelligence service, they simply said they didn't have enough personnel under their command to deploy around the city to secure the city, and so by 2:30 p.m. there was not enough security around the city to, certainly not to assure the security of the president and his senior ministers and his wife, and at that point it was get out while you can.
Right. I'm going to get us outside of Kabul in a moment, but I think it's important for us at this moment, as we've talked about all of these security officials melting away in civilian clothes, but it's also important to reflect a little bit on the security forces that actually were on their checkpoints, that actually were making a stand, that were giving casualties, and that were waiting for directions, actually. Can you speak a little bit about those units? These weren't that was not the predominant mood of ANDSF around that afternoon or that morning on the 15th of August, but that was also not that sense of surrender was also not the only sense that was happening. Collapse was happening along different axes. People were living different realities depending on where they were and what their mood was like. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, you're definitely right. There was some isolated instances of defence of the city, and in particular in the south of Kabul there was a battalion of Commandos, and it's actually where the Commandos were one of the major commando training bases. And on that morning, as you described, it started out as a regular morning where one of the senior generals was planning a trip there to oversee a parade to inaugurate a new commando unit, and he never made it to this parade, but instead the battalion at this base ended up basically fighting to defend the southern flank of Kabul, all on their own, and all the while trying to maintain communications with their leadership in central Kabul and waiting for orders, but all the while taking the initiative themselves to defend. I mean, to do as they had been trained to do, and I guess their training and their sense of duty was perhaps greater than the lesser trained regular fighters that were stationed at other points around the capital. But in the end, they were told to retreat to the airport because they were going to become isolated themselves, and they were one of the very few remaining functional fighting forces.
Right, and that's certainly my observation as well, because when I was in the airport in the midnight that I described between the 15th and the 16th of August, the only semblance of any order or any last vestiges of the Republic were really isolated units of the special forces that were still around on the tarmac, trying to do their job, actually, on this particular occasion. But if we were to sort of move a little bit further, but to add to this, before we go outside of Kabul, 2 days before the collapse of Kabul, or maybe 3 days, Ghazni province was actually handed over to the Taliban in a deal made between the Taliban and Ghazni's provincial governor. But as the provincial governor was making this deal, shaking hands with the Taliban and getting his amnesty to leave the province, there was an outpost where an amalgam of security forces, police, and ANA, the National Army troops, were making a last stand. And you could argue that the provincial governor had actually sold these guys out, not letting them know that he had cut this deal, not negotiating their safety, and just leaving town just like that, as these isolated, this outpost was making a fight, and they were killed almost to the man, because that point was overwhelmed as the provincial governor left the province and handed everything over to the Taliban. But these were events that were happening, and you also tell the story of a particular Taliban fighter whose nom de guerre is Abu Dajana, right? This guy was stationed in a province not too far from Kabul in Wardak, and he had been with the Taliban for about 10 years, and he had been in that 10 years primarily focused on one objective, and that objective was to get this main base or forward operating base of the Afghan National Army called Camp Antenna or Base Antenna.
Antenna Post.
Antenna Post. Now, Australian soldiers, 39,000 of them have served in Afghanistan over the past 20 years or 19 years that they were there. They would make multiple rotations, some of them under extremely difficult circumstances, but those rotations are relatively short. They were not 10 years. Afghan National Army soldiers, given the attrition, given the high casualty rates, and given the desertion rates, it was difficult by the last few years of the Republic to find somebody who had served for 10 years and survived. And yet here was this Taliban soldier who had been there for 10 years, and he'd been focused on this particular camp, this particular base. Can you speak to what that means for a war when one side of the belligerents are suffering, are in their mental algorithm, are thinking of the war in terms of deployments, in terms of electoral cycles, in terms of attrition, in terms of desertion. But the other side is thinking quite differently, right? Can you reflect on that and what you thought that meant for the overall trajectory, the Achilles heel of this project of keeping the Taliban down?
There's the classic, I don't know if it was a Afghan proverb, but it's become a cliche now, and you will roll your eyes at it, but the Taliban, I don't even know who to attribute it to, but it
probably Anand Gopal.
Okay, it goes, the Taliban would say that you have the watches, but we have the time, and I mean it's quite accurate, and I think the international, the soldiers from the international coalition that I've spoken to in the past few years, from speaking to them, what always strikes me is that although some of them may have signed up to the military and specifically to fight in the hope of fighting in Afghanistan to perhaps avenge the attacks of 9/11, many of them, or even most of them, in my experience, ended up finding the day-to-day battles, their war, being more about looking after their soldiers on their left and right, and more so than a battle of ideology or let alone politics, and so it became, I think that's where, there was less of a all-encompassing driving force behind the individuals that made up this, hundreds of thousands strong international military coalition. And obviously I'm speaking to the international side rather than the Afghan government side here, but in comparison to the Taliban, who had this very direct, very focused goal that was based, for the most part, on ideology. I'm sure that there were many Taliban fighters, in my understanding, who probably signed up for more pragmatic reasons, but underpinning it all was this ideology of overcoming the invaders and fighting in the name of Islam, and your obligation under Islam to fight jihad. And I think it's a very difficult foe to come up against, certainly for the foreigners who did not have that investment, did not have that cause, that reason to fight for. And as far as and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you know far more about it than I do, I think from the Afghan government, the military forces belonging to the Afghan government side, my sense is that they just, in the end, didn't have enough belief in who they were fighting for, and I don't think they felt that the government that they were fighting for were willing to fight for them in the end. And so it was, in that sense, I think there was always a sense of inevitability to it. In the end, if we were talking, put aside war material and experience and arms and ammunition and air force and all these things, like on paper, the internationally backed Afghan government should have wiped the Taliban out years ago and should have been able to continue on for years to come. But I think the morale and the lack of will to fight and to die, and many did, for the government that they had sworn to protect, it just wasn't there in the end.
I think there's something to be said about that. I think the Taliban were at least using outwardly the rhetoric of defense, of holy war, of jihad, of Islam, or of my homeland, of my honor, right? And these are things that everybody can relate to, can understand, and these are things that could probably even motivate some people here. But on the other side of the spectrum was defense of the republic. And if I were to ask the people here, how do you define a republic? I think it would be difficult for most people to sort of articulate what a republic really even is. You would think democracy, sure, but a republic. So the battle lines have been honored, homeland, religion versus republic, to the extent that it was a thing. And so it becomes really hard when war becomes grinding and it becomes attritional, and you need that story to tell yourself as to why you're fighting. And I think those stories become very powerful. But in 2014, the U.S. Senate Foreign Affairs Committee held a hearing of U.S. DoD officials. And one of the things that came out of this hearing was that the DoD officials were saying that the improvised explosive devices that were going off in Afghanistan, planted by the Taliban, were using the primary explosive material of ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is really just a fertilizer, right? And 80%, according to this American figure, 80% of the ammonium nitrate used in explosive devices across Afghanistan came from 2 factories in Pakistan. And so when you talk about morale, when you talk about focus, when you talk about belief and a narrative for war, those things matter. But there are other things also that matter, because war is, if some of it is about morale and some of it is about motivation, to a large degree, it's also about the ability to fight, right? The material, the bullets that you use. And for all of its efforts, the US was never able to stop or force the Pakistanis to stop the flow of ammonium nitrate in 2014, because at that time, American forces were giving significant casualties to these explosive devices planted by the Taliban using Pakistani-made explosives. And so the Pakistanis were contributing two things for the material of war. One was a significant supply of Pakistani religious educated Afghans, the Taliban, aka religious students, but also these other things. As part of my job was to work with the Pakistanis and others to implement the UN Security Council Resolution 1988, which prevents any country from giving material to the Taliban that could be used in the war. And we had really a significant amount of difficulty convincing the Pakistanis that ammonium nitrate was a problem, that you shouldn't be sending it to us. But under the Pakistani law, ammonium nitrate is not covered under explosives material. It's covered under the British era law, the Poison Control Act. So they thought of it as a poison, not as a primary explosive material covered under the UN sanctions. So there were a lot of these complications happening. So there was an external dimension to the war, and one of those external dimensions to the war were also the American parallel effort to the side to speak with the Taliban about Afghanistan to the exclusion of Afghans, right? And that has a fundamental effect on not just how the people of Afghanistan feel about themselves, but also how the politicians in Afghanistan position themselves when they see the winds shifting, but also how the soldiers who are fighting and dying and starving and waiting for medevac, how they feel. Can you speak a little bit about, because it happened in two waves. Number one was the negotiation of that deal, the conclusion of that deal. And then number two, 14 months after that, the announcement by Biden to completely withdraw from Afghanistan. What do you think were the effects of that, on the one hand, on the Afghan forces, but on the other hand, on the Taliban forces?
The deal that was signed on the 29th of February 2020 that came from this about 18 months of negotiation, which came after several years of more secretive negotiation, was heralded by the Taliban as victory in across much of the country. I think the deal, the Doha Agreement, as it was known, was from the American side. It was, and this was at a time that President Trump was in power, and I mean, it's a simplistic way of looking at it, but to me, it looked as though it was a deal that the primary motivation of which was a domestic political one that would help to get President Trump re-elected early the following year, and in return for which the Afghan government was kind of thrown under the bus. There was a lot of pressure put on them by the US government to firstly release 5,000 Taliban prisoners as a confidence building measure. There were what were some of the other? I mean, the stipulations placed on the Taliban at this point were very vague. They were told that they agreed that they would no longer harbour transnational terrorists or allow them to conduct attacks against the US or their enemies. There were things that were quite difficult to police, and the mechanisms in the agreement that were designed to prevent the Americans' primary, what the Americans primarily agreed to in the agreement, that being to withdraw all their forces and international forces within about 18 months' time, would be halted. And so I think this, and once the Taliban's prisoners started to be released and inevitably returned to the battleground, that was the other thing I was thinking of. The other confidence building measure that the Americans very strongly encouraged the Afghan government to make was to set their military forces to what was termed an active defensive posture, which basically confined them to their bases, prevented them from going out and conducting offensive operations, and also limited. And the Americans were also very limited to the extent they could use their air power. And so the Taliban were able to use these political circumstances to really take the offensive, while the Afghan soldiers were very much told that they pretty much had to sit on their hands. And so I think the Afghan soldiers felt very much abandoned. Many I spoke to talked about how they thought the Americans were now siding with the Taliban and were basically playing a game of politics whereby they saw the return of the Taliban inevitable and working to that inevitability in a way that looked palatable publicly.
Right, and you can imagine the impacts of that on the morale of a soldier, right? Who would want to be cannon fodder to slow down the ultimate role of this juggernaut coming to take over everything, right? Nobody would want to be that person in that situation. But I think in the book you also profile Nadia, who is this young woman who goes to a madrasa that she calls university. And I don't blame her because the madrasas themselves call themselves university. They call themselves Jama'ah, right? And the impact of the Taliban, their Taliban 1.0, Taliban 2.0, and in the middle, on the lives of women like that and other women like her who lived in Kabul city, but also in this broader climate of insecurity that the Taliban are enabling by undermining the government. ISIS is active, attacking Hazaras in their schools, in their sports centers, in their homes, as they're transiting between different cities. Not that the Taliban aren't doing that, they are doing that as well, but ISIS is doing that also. And now, when we talk about the US Taliban deal, when we talk about the Pakistanis and their fertilizers, and we're talking about the UN Security Council resolutions, and we're talking about antenna posts, we're also talking about the stories of these people who have no say in what is happening all over here, and who are not actively fighting or not, but their lives are being affected in fundamental ways by the changes that are happening. Can you reflect a little bit about that, in particular in the lives of course we've heard a lot about how the Taliban have stopped secondary education for girls, and that's an important salient feature of their gender policy, but there are many other dimensions in which the Taliban are affecting the lives of Afghan women. Their coming to power is affecting the lives of everybody who's not Taliban, including religious minorities, the Shias, the Hazaras, even Tajiks and Panjshiris who are fighting against the Taliban at the moment. Can you reflect on the multiple ways in which all of this has affected all of these people who have not had a say or been participants of the process, but they had been beneficiaries of the process in which they had rights, cities were relatively safe, education was accessible, and all of that?
This dynamic you're talking about reminded me a little bit about what we saw in the US when Trump came to power, kind of enabling a fringe of society to legitimizing a fringe of society and some more fringe beliefs and this kind of thing. For me and for Nadia, as you mentioned, she was a prime example. Her family had been very much pro-government for many years. Her father had been a policeman under the Soviet-supported communist regime in the 1980s, and her older brother had been a police officer under the Afghan Republic, and for that reason, in the later years of the war, their family became targeted by the Taliban, who, as they gathered momentum and territory across the country, they were able to put more and more pressure on families like Nadia's who had sided with the government for one reason or another. And so after spending several years out of the country as refugees, hiding from the Taliban, first Taliban 1.0 and then Taliban 2.0, and sending Nadia's elder brother, the policeman, off to Europe amongst the hundreds of thousands that made up the trail of migrants toward Europe in that year. They moved back to Kabul from Pakistan, choosing to live in the big 5 to 6 million strong metropolis of Kabul rather than their ancestral village, where they were a lot more vulnerable to the Taliban, who were a lot closer in proximity to them there, thinking that they could if they could no longer run from the Taliban, at least they could hide amongst the population in Kabul. And in the months leading up to the Taliban's takeover, when it became apparent that soon not only would they not be able to run anymore, but they wouldn't be able to hide, Nadia's father started to try to come up with ways that they could act and in order to save the family. And first of all, when Nadia's father was given this suggestion by a friend of his, that being to hand Nadia over to a Taliban fighter as a bride in return for to appease the Taliban, who had been threatening their family for decades by this stage. He and one of his sons started to dehumanise Nadia. They started to beat her and to treat her like a commodity that would be able to serve them, that would be able to would be their ticket out of harm's way. And I mean, this was, I guess, this was also seen. I saw this in much less stark terms on the day of the Taliban's arrival in Kabul and the weeks and months since then, where you see people who perhaps have no affinity towards the Taliban, no sympathy for their ideology or their rule, ingratiating themselves in some way as a way of surviving. So you might have had a resident of Kabul pre-August last year with flying a flag of the Afghan Republic from their car and a decal of one of the Republic's military heroes. Within a matter of days, those were stripped from the car and instead replaced with the Taliban flag and maybe the Islamic kalima, the Declaration of Faith, scrawled across the back windscreen, and it's it was very striking for me to see this visual transformation of the way people went about their lives and acted as a means of survival. And obviously Nadia's case is a far more difficult one to stomach.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very stark example of how the lives of many, literally everybody who's not a Taliban has been appended, but in particular the fundamental aspect of the whole being of women in public spaces, in universities, in schools has been affected. And it in some cases, it's unimaginable to think what the downstream effects of that would be in 5 years and 10 years and in 20 years for those people, but also for that country. We have about 15 minutes to take audience questions. I'm going to open the floor to the audience. I would request you to keep your questions as short as you can. And if you have comments, please keep them as short as you can. But we are ready to take audience questions. The gentleman with the glasses, please.
Look, thanks I lived in Afghanistan between 1998 and 2001. It's been the last 20 years, it's been the most extraordinary diorama of what it is to be human on a global scale. I watched the last 20 years, just astonishing at what's happened. It goes from the education of women all the way through to the Brereton inquiry and the results of that. It's just such this massive situation that's affected all of us in such a long period of time. But you mentioned the lack of belief in the Republic. And I wanted to ask, how much Afghanistan is a very strikingly multi-ethnic society. Deep down with Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, the lines are quite stark. How much did you think that character of the Afghan population contributed to the speed of the downfall of Afghanistan? And then the second question was, does the future cycle of Afghanistan necessarily involve or include an internecine conflict within these different ethnic constituents before a credible military or political opposition can appear?
Thank you. If I were, let me just quickly paraphrase what you just said. You said that Afghanistan is a very multi-ethnic country, and to what extent do you think that multi-ethnic character of the country contributed towards the fall of the country, and to what extent do you think that might be relevant in future efforts in Afghanistan to build a centralized state? I'm taking creative liberty.
A centralized state, a credible opposition to the Taliban.
A credible opposition to the Taliban, military opposition to the Taliban, or political.
I think Shuja probably has far more authority to answer these questions than I do. Coming from an ethnic minority yourself, can I hand it over to you?
That was very artfully done. No, but I think what you're saying is fundamental in how Afghanistan has functioned over the past over 200 years I think. And Afghanistan is not the only country that's multi-ethnic, right? Australia is multi-ethnic. The US is multi-ethnic. Pakistan is multi-ethnic. And if you think of a word association where, when you ask, what comes to mind when you think about Afghanistan, you might say poverty, a lack of central government control, multi-ethnic, ethnic fissures. You can say a weak state. You can say an insurgency. Those are all of the things that are also relevant to Pakistan, right? Pakistan is suffering from the exact same things. But I think the difference is that the Pakistanis don't have a strong externally sponsored insurgency. That's one. And number two is that the Pakistanis, for all of their faults, the government's faults, have found a political formula under which the provinces can share power. They've found credible enough elections in which credible victors can emerge and be acceptable to the broad enough segment of society. And I think Afghanistan has always struggled with that, which is to find a political formula in which political power is shared and the rules of the game and the rules of sharing are clear. In Australia, when there's political differences, I know that after World War II, for example, taxation was one of the challenges between the central government and the states. You didn't go onto the streets to fight each other. You went to the High Court, and the High Court, in a series of 2 decisions, settled that question for good. And now you have a formula in which the states and the federal government can live together. So I think, to me, differences exist in all human society. Differences have existed in Afghanistan, but I think for us to come to that realization of finding a political formula in the form of a constitution that is drafted and accepted by everybody is going to be key. Now, there's a lot to be said in terms of nuances and how the constitution of the post-Taliban 1.0 Afghanistan came to being. There's a lot of nuances there. But I'll stop there, and I think there was a hand here. We can go to you, and then there was a hand here. We'll take both of your questions, and then we can take it from there.
Well, mine's more about just the practical living there and how you be a known identity, publishing, telling stories, and not endangering people that you're in contact with and you're living amongst, and your direct relationships, how you navigate that. I suppose you're very selective about what you publish, but I just wonder if that's a big tension for you when you're living there.
The question was, your known identity, how do you live safely, but also how do you tell the stories of the people that you work with safely without endangering their lives in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that was particularly concerning at the point that the government changed hands, because all of a sudden, for all the years that I'd been, and this is particularly the case with photographs, for all the years I'd been photographing very willingly members of the security forces and the government with their name tags and fully identifiable, under the assumption that they would stay in power and there would be areas in which they would be safe to live and work. When that all changed on August 15 last year, all those photographs and all those stories potentially became sources of danger, weaponised, exactly, for these people. And look, it's a difficult one. I mean, they're out there. I can't bring them back. And a lot of these, I mean, despite the assurances of amnesty that were provided by the Taliban, and which I, as Shuja mentioned, I desperately wanted to believe in, they have, in many cases, they have not been honoured. I think that the Taliban have used the members of the security forces and the former government that they can benefit from. I mean, they've recalled Afghan pilots to teach them how to fly the helicopters, and members of the public service to show them how the systems work. And but those who are not of practical use to them are very much expendable and at risk. And there are people that I personally know of who were assured amnesty but have not been granted it, and far from it. And so it's certainly, I think that the calculation that people were making before and after has changed. I think now the way it's changed is that people are certainly much less willing to speak out against the ruling government than they were previously. And I think, look, and I never felt particularly unsafe reporting critically of the former government or of the Americans or international forces, whereas now that calculation is altogether different, and especially so for Afghan reporters. I mean, the chilling effect on Afghan journalism is, I mean, it's total, exactly. And for foreign journalists, everyone's definitely very conscious of what they're reporting, and some have been expelled from the country and refused visa renewals and so on. So it's a big difference.
And to add to that, Andrew, some of the Afghan journalists have been taken into custody, beaten, tortured, intimidated. So a lot of that is happening. But when you think about Afghanistan and you imagine what a person from Afghanistan looks like, I think most of us have a certain conception of what they look like. But I think for somebody like me, and probably some people in this audience, of the Hazara identity, we look distinct even within Afghanistan itself. It is very easy to tell who a Hazara is and who is not a Hazara. And so it becomes a lot harder to blend in and to move from Kabul to a different city and to be able to feel safe as you're going between those cities. And so identity is still very much at the core of not just people's ability to survive, but also their vulnerability, not just to the Taliban, but also to ISIS, which has a particular zeal in targeting Shias, and in Afghanistan, primarily the Shias, the vast majority of them are Hazaras, and you're seeing some of that. Now, I'll stop my comments there. I know that we had questions here as well.
Hi, I haven't yet read your book. Looking forward to it. But I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, a bit of a spoiler, don't worry, telling what happened to Nadia, or if that, I'm not sure if you go into more depth in the book, or...
The question is, spoiler alert, can you tell us what happens to the character Nadia?
This is spoiler, don't worry. I'm happy to say read the book.
Yeah, I think I should leave that. Especially, yeah. Yeah.
We have a question there, please.
I can tell you privately later if you like.
I just wanted to ask, what can Australia do, what can the Australian people do, considering the plight in Afghanistan?
What can Australia do and what can the Australian people do considering the plight of the people in Afghanistan? Now, don't throw this one to me.
Well, I was listening to an Afghan author speak in Melbourne last week, and he was in fact one of the 400 plus passengers aboard the Tampa that you'll all remember in 2001, and was settled in New Zealand. And his answer to that question was, in the current climate where you have a lot of, I suppose, for want of a better word, competition for refugee allocation in our part of the world, at a time when there are still tens of thousands of Afghans who either have valid visas for Australia or have got pending humanitarian visas waiting to be processed. Write to your local member, write to the Ministry of Immigration. I've done that, and in fact, I got a response, a two-page letter in response from the Minister of Immigration recently. There is a huge, backlog of I think around 200,000 applications for emergency humanitarian visas, and I think there are about 30,000 through them. And that's after 1 year, and I think the political imperative for granting those visas is only going to shrink from now on, particularly with other conflicts sparking up since then. But the moral imperative remains. Our involvement in Afghanistan is well known, and I think the moral obligation that outlasts the war itself speaks for itself, and so I think that's something you can do. There are certainly also I know there are thousands of Afghans who have been they've been brought to Australia but have yet to find resettlement options, housing options. There are still hundreds living in hotels in Melbourne, for one thing, and who simply need homes to move into or families to take them in. There is, if you come to see me after, I have a link for one program that is offering to facilitate these kinds of resettlement options.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, please. And this is going to be our last question.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks very much indeed for a really interesting conversation. I'm just wondering what you think about the role of international NGOs prior to August and now.
What do you think of the role of international NGOs prior to August 2021 and now?
Oh, it's such a big question, isn't it?
It's a tough audience.
Yeah. I mean, Shuja worked for one of them, and I've worked for them as well. I mean, I think there's a big argument to make that. I mean, look, you see the work that these NGOs do on the ground, and it seems valuable and it seems necessary at the time. When you look at it more broadly over the course of 10 or 20 years, I guess the question that often comes to mind, and that I know that a lot of people that work for these NGOs wrestle with, and the reason for which some of them have left the industry. I mean, and it is an industry. These NGOs the staff members of these NGOs are well paid, very, very well paid. And I think that for me, and apologies if I'm being cynical, the idea of the humanitarian that I had before I'd gone to Afghanistan and that which I have now is very different. I mean, there's plenty of humanitarians who are in Afghanistan who are flying out on business class and spending their 2 weeks every 2 months in the Maldives, or they would even talk about the discussions they would have. God, I'm really putting the boot in here, but they had so much leave that they began to struggle to decide where they would go next on the next 2 week block of leave. But I think that the point I was getting to was that the reliance that people in Afghanistan often ended up having on these NGOs, it was quite profound. I think I remember one elder I spoke to in Uruzgan, where Australian forces were deployed, who told me that once upon a time we would clean out the irrigation ditches on our field because that's what we needed to grow our crops. Now the young farmers won't do it unless an NGO pays them to do it, and so there's been a bit of this sort of enabling of a desire for, or a need for handouts to do anything is definitely something that was pretty apparent to me.
I think you're right that there is that need, or there is a certain level of dependency in certain situations. It is also, I think, worth sort of remarking that when the people were cleaning their own irrigation drains, those irrigation canals were very few and far in between, so that the village could do it, right, without having to bring in specialized labor. But when agriculture grew in scale and development started and people started growing farms in larger areas and acreages, it became hard to actually do it on your own. So you needed to bring in specialized labor. So I think some of it is that, but some of it is, I think, that pathology of dependency. So it's important to note that. You mentioned, or at least in the intro, Dan mentioned that I worked for the American University of Afghanistan for a while. And I joined the American University of Afghanistan after the attack on campus by the Taliban that led to the deaths of, or the brutal killings of, a professor, 5 students, a number of university staff and university guards, including a Special Operations Forces commander who was sent in to stop the attack from happening. And so the way the attack happened, and this was the Taliban who attacked the campus in 2016, the way this happened was that they actually sent a vehicle chock full of explosives and parked it in the compound next to the American University of Afghanistan, because the university was very, very well guarded. The compound next to it was less so. And this compound was, and when they parked it and they exploded the vehicle to clear a path into the university, and that's how they went in. They killed, and there was a rampage. This other compound was actually the Kabul School for the Blind, which luckily was not in session when this happened. It was only one guard, and they overpowered the guard, forcefully opened its gates, and parked their explosive-laden vehicle. But I went to this school after the explosion, and I was trying to document some of the effects of it. And if you know anybody in your family who has grown blind, you will notice that, at least in this occasion, I noticed that the students and the graduates of this school had a tremendous attachment to that school, because this was a building that they could walk around very easily. They knew how far the restrooms were. They knew how far the teacher's desk was. They felt comfortable and at home here, right? And they came back and they started teaching there. They came back and they started running things in that school for the blind. So the Taliban, in that one attack, damaged severely this oasis that the School for the Blind had for its students and its alumni. but also the students, university, and professors at the American University of Afghanistan. Now, that university reopened in about 6 months after that attack. Students, a lot of them came back, a lot of them graduated, and the university was functional until August of 2021. So between August 2016, first Taliban attack, August 2021, and that's when the university stopped operating altogether. And when you hear about the story of Nadia, you'll also hear a lot of other stories of students of this university, women, men, minorities, others, who had this oasis where they could study, ask, learn. But that's not active anymore. And the same people who attacked this university are now in charge of the entire country. I think in that story, I think, is the juxtaposition that is suitable for the entire country. These people had attacked cafes, they had attacked buses of civil servants going to work, they had attacked supermarkets, and now they're in charge of that city where they had made all of those attacks. I think it makes for a very poignant story, but also a far more difficult reality for people living in that country under those circumstances. And so when the 211,000 people who have applied for special humanitarian visas to Australia, there's 35 slots for that, and those visas, which started being applied for in August of 2021, are not issuing. They're not issuing fast enough. There's only a handful that have been issued, right? And I think one thing you could do tangibly is to call the minister and say, why are we not issuing these visas? And the minister can tell you a number of reasons, but I think the reason to move fast is far greater, I think, than the reasons for why there shouldn't be urgent action. I will stop my comments there. I know that I've spoken as much as you have, and you were the guest here. But I can give a full-throated endorsement of the book. It's extremely well researched. It's very well written, and I wish all of you happy reading. And thank you for all of the work you've done, Andrew, over the years in Afghanistan, and for writing this book.
Thanks, Shuja. Thanks so much.